Behold, my glorious supporter Liliana has asked. No, this is not something crazy this time. Why doesn't anybody understand Warframe? Why is this so hard? Okay, that's not exactly what you asked. So Liliana says Warframe is often misunderstood not only by the players but by the developers as well. Crit is king. Very nice touch. Give me your thoughts on why this might be, and share some ideas on how we as a community could begin to solve this problem in the future. Why doesn't anyone understand this game? It's really not that complicated. So first, I want to get something out of the way. You see I'm in a certain mood right now. Yeah, I mean it's literally my career to explain this thing, and I usually don't approach it this way because I feel like it's not useful to just stamp your foot and say be smarter. But in all seriousness, let's just get a premise out of the way here. Warframe is not objectively that complicated. Like, there are plenty of games that all of you, people who play Warframe also play, that are as much, if not much more complicated. It's not because Warframe is really that oblique, you know? It doesn't have nothing to do with that. It is related to how the game is designed, and we're going to get into why I think that it is misunderstood in just a second. But I do just want to establish that it's not because Warframe is really like this enigma of a game. It's not. It really isn't. Like, a lot of the concepts that people are misunderstanding that actually matter are not hard to understand in the abstract. And most people in most other game communities understand these concepts very easily. A very good example is marginal benefit analysis. This is the idea that once you have a lot of one multiplier, it's better to get more of another one, even if you're getting a lot of the first one. So in other words, piling on base damage. Why isn't heavy caliber a good damage increase if it's so much damage? Well, it's because you already have serration. Why is it more damage to get numerically less elemental damage than to use heavy caliber? It's because you already have so much base damage, and that's the same multiplier. Heavy caliber is just adding to that base damage you have, whereas the elemental damage will be multiplied by the base damage you have, which ends up being a larger amount of damage. It's not a complicated concept, and there are games, a notable example is Fate Grand Order, in which this is a less important concept, but it's better understood by the community. So clearly, it's not that the concept is so hard to understand. Like, it's not hard to explain. It's not something that people have trouble with in most communities. So why in this game, you know? So just keep that in mind as we go forward. I think there are basically two different things. Now, keep in mind, I don't script these, so by the end of this, it'll be interesting to see if maybe there's some other reason. But most of the time when people ask Parley questions, I'm looking at the Parley questions right now. I have this document where they're all listed. Usually I don't need to write show notes about them because I know exactly what I want to say about each thing the moment it's asked. I saw this question 2 days ago, and I knew what I was going to say as soon as I saw it. But that doesn't mean I won't think of other things. So for now, two things. This is how far into the video? Okay, that's fine. That is some important, starting stuff. So if it's not because it's complicated, why don't people understand it? Well, it's not like it's not complicated. Two primary things, and then sort of a third thing underpinning these things is it's not like it isn't complicated. Like, if it was the simplest thing in the world, obviously we wouldn't have these problems. So it's moderately complicated, whatever, but it's nothing special in complexity. The community has a certain attitude toward the developers, and the developers have a certain attitude toward the community. Okay, I'm just kidding. But the first thing, the most obvious thing, is that the developers treat the community like they won't be able to figure it out. So this is the most obvious reason I can think of. Why do we have a community that doesn't try to figure things out? It's because the developers remove the opportunity for that to happen before it's even a problem. A lot of the time when people don't immediately love something day one, it's less than a week, oftentimes literally not even, less than a week in days, less than 7 days, but literally less than like that same week, the thing is changed in a way that, the players will understand it better or something. A very good example of this is Warframe abilities. When a new Warframe comes out, I can't remember the last time a new Warframe released that was not good. like that wasn't like objectively pretty powerful. But players don't get how they work, and they complain, and the developers do not wait for the players to, play with the thing for like a week or two and see if they figure it out. They just change it and make it more powerful. This is how we have a lot of frames that have these overbearing abilities, because the ability was misunderstood at launch, and then it was buffed before the players had time to understand it, making it then just overpowered, and then, okay, of course, Our developers know, wisely, that when you buff something, players think that it's good, and players thinking something is good does affect how good it actually is, and also how much people enjoy using it. People don't want to feel like they're using something they like, but they have to sacrifice it being good. They want the thing they like to be good. People also have this troubling perception that when something is good, that means it's not fun, and when something is fun, that means it's not good. Combining all this together, our developers, again, wisely understand that, like most good developers, that if they buff something, people will use it more, even if the buff doesn't really matter. However, the reverse is also a problem, and something I don't think our developers understand, which is that when you buff something, it sort of prevents the players from understanding how it could have been good. It's just powerful now in the common, consensus. It doesn't give the players the opportunity to use a balanced ability in a powerful way. They only ever use powerful abilities in powerful ways, and that makes for a power creepy and sometimes less fun game where abilities are just good. It's just a pile of good stuff. It's not really as interactive sometimes. Now, this isn't always true. I do think that if players think something doesn't feel powerful enough, even if it feels powerful enough, that doesn't mean you shouldn't buff it, because sometimes it will just feel powerful enough, and it was already powerful before. You made it technically more powerful, but maybe not in a way that matters, and then suddenly we're good to go. That's fine. There have been buffs in this game and others like that as well. But in general, it's not the greatest idea, and I hope you can see how buffing things very quickly when players complain about them creates this situation where nobody has the opportunity to try a thing before they buy a thing. The Warframe, we'll get to that point in just a second, but before they, complain that it's not good enough. A big point here is that most of the time, most of the players see a Warframe's performance on day one of the update from not themselves, from a Warframe partner. And they don't have the frame yet when the patch goes through. Warframes take 3 days to build, Digital Extremes, and most people can't farm them in that time. So if a player is not paying for a Warframe, that means you're changing the frame before they even play it that way, and most of your complaints are coming from people who did not play the previous version of the frame. So even if you disagree that they should or should not buff things, we can at least agree that you should let people, try it before you change it. And objectively, by the numbers, it doesn't seem like that is even physically possible most of the time. If you don't rush the build and you don't buy it from the market, you can't even physically possibly have the frame before it is buffed. Let people get the frame. Wait a week or two, So, that. But this ties into the second half of the issue, which is the way that the player base reacts to these things. Now, this is a little bit challenging because it creates a sort of chicken before the egg situation. Is the community this way because the developers constantly change everything before its community has some time to think about it and try it? Or is it because the community acts this way in the first place that the developers have to do that? What is this way the community acts? Well, they're pretty knee-jerk about stuff. A lot of the community will complain about things before trying them. They'll just read the patch notes and then say the thing seems like a problem. Like there was a nerf. The text in the patch notes amounts to the thing being worse, and so they say, "Oh, it's useless now. DE took my fun away again." This hardly ever happens. The number of times that something is just fun and there's no greater gameplay consequences and it's changed for the worse, I cannot give you an example. That wasn't clearly an accident, not to say that that's not a problem, but that's a separate video. Think status revised, for example. Gas and corrosive were in fairly good places and were nerfed for no good reason, and it didn't benefit the game in any way. But it clearly, there was no possible reason for them to be intentionally nerfed. It must have just been a mistake, as unbelievable as that sounds, or a misunderstanding. That wasn't them intentionally they make video games for a living. They're not trying to take your fun away. That's stupid. It's always just a waste of time to bring up that topic. The question is, what did they misunderstand? Not why are they taking away our fun, even though they've devoted their entire lives to making a video game for fun. Stop saying that. It's a waste of everyone's time. But we can talk about where the misunderstanding is. And because a lot of people don't talk about where the misunderstanding is, we have this climate in the community where the players are kind of trying to get one up on the developers. Joey Zero has a very good video about this, about it being too late to nerf intrinsic farming in Railjack, which you should go watch. In fact, let me write a note and I'll link that. Joey Zero intrinsic should be enough for me to remember. It encapsulates that idea quite well, but it's basically that, just shameless plugging my friend, really. But it is on this same topic if you want to hear about that more. This idea that the players are sort of racing with the developers to find a way a thing is broken or problematic before the developers have time to react, or just think about it, before the rest of the community has time to react too. Before the normal players grind the thing out normally, some players are sort of racing to find a way to break that meta. Now, this is always going to happen. The problem is with the tone or the extremeness of that climate. Every game has this thing where the players try to get one up on the developers. A lot of games even have a sort of social way in which this is part of the game. Hollow Knight is a good example of a game where the developers designed it around the players trying to break it, and put some mechanics in that are very non-explicit and never really used in the game if you play it normally, but if you're looking for exploits, suddenly you can feel the developers there, knowing that you're going to do that thing. That can be good in some games. Warframe is a bit too vast a game, I think, for that to be the case. And there are, it's a comparatively small team for a game this big, and so for a live service game this big. And so, of course, the players are going to find things the developers will miss. Getting to the crux of the issue, why is this a problem? What is the level of extremeness that makes this such an issue? Well, it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing. Again, it's like it fits into that loop. If the developers do something that is too quick, or there's not enough time to react, the players will always be there with a response, saying either that the game is being made too new player friendly, or it's not relevant to most players, which is the opposite, or that the thing is too overpowered and there's too much power creep, or the thing is too weak. There's really no way to win. And because the community is so knee-jerk about that, there's this culture where, again, the two problems feed into each other. The developers feel like they have to react, else they have this backlash. And the players feel like they have to backlash to get the reaction they want, because they do. The developers react every time quickly, and so the backlash appears to work. And so you get people saying things, even to me. People yell at me all the time and say, why don't you yell at the developers to get what you want? And I say, because that's inhumane and unacceptable. And they say, but it's the only thing they listen to. No, it's just that the players never don't yell. And you don't know whether the developers would fix the thing if you didn't yell, because you always yell. You've never tried seeing what happens if you just say nothing and let them develop the game that they made for fun, that they want to make good, and see, would they be able to do it well if you didn't yell at them? Maybe even better if you didn't yell at them? We'll never know, because you won't stop yelling at them, I say to the player. And of course, this will change nothing. It's impossible. So there are kind of two ways to go forward from here. What you could ask, but why are those two issues? What is it about the game that makes those things issues? I have something to say about that. And then how do we move forward from here, which is your question, the two halves of your question. So I think that's the thing I just explained is kind of what most people would respond if they feel like they know what's going on. But there is sort of a more root reason for this to be the case. And the reason is that Warframe has this kind of odd cocktail of no clear direction, but a lot of possible directions for the player. A common complaint is that people get into the beginning of the game, Start Chart opens up, and they have no idea what to do. And the statistics, we're told by our developers, show that players often quit right then when the game opens up because they just don't know what to do. They had a fairly good experience, but then they're just overwhelmed. They don't know what to do. Personally, I don't really see how. I've always had trouble understanding that because I think about other games that have that experience much more prominently. But Warframe is structured in a pretty unique way, and so I can understand some level of confusion. It does need a better new player experience. They're working on that. We know. So go figure. But anyway, for what it's worth, that I can see how that would be confusing, I suppose. But again, it's not that it's so maybe objectively confusing. I think what's adding on to the difficulty here is actually the fact that it isn't as important to understand the game mechanics. This creates a sort of anxiety in players where you don't know what you want to prioritize because you don't know what you need to prioritize. In Warframe's case, because you don't need to prioritize anything. So you have nothing to focus on. Even if it was just the game is harder, and so you think, well, I care more about damage. That would at least give you something to hold on to and hang your coat on when you come into the game and think, okay, well, if something is going to give me more damage, I specifically care about that more than just obviously progression because progression. How important is it to get many different kinds of mods? How important is it to rank up those mods at a certain part of the game? How important is it to max out those mods? How important is it to have certain elements? How important is it to format your weapons early? How important is it to have mastery early? Etc., etc., right? All these things are a little important, but not crucially important. And one of Warframe's strengths, in my opinion, is that for some types of players who don't really care what priority I need to follow, I'm okay with just making my own, this is quite freeing. It's exciting to have the game sort of say, we're not going to make you do any really specific thing. You could just care about whatever systems you want. I say, yay, great. Although we'll come back to that later. It can be a problem as well. But there are plenty of kinds of players that do want more guidance, at least early on, which is totally reasonable. And the game's lack of an impetus to focus on a specific thing actually paralyzes players a bit. Now, why is this related to the issue of people misunderstanding the game? It sounds like I'm saying that you don't have to understand the game, so what's going on? Well, but people don't know, There's nothing that they're rubbing up against that's a problem now, but the game has a long progression, and they worry that they're going to be investing in something that won't be worthwhile down the line, or they'll, how much forma do you get? How gettable is forma? Potatoes, organ catalysts, and reactors. How many more of those am I going to get? How many slots am I going to get? And when? How? Stuff like that. These are probably the most common new player questions I am asked. Or how important is it to get a new Warframe? Which Warframes are good? Definitely the most popular question I am asked. Which is why I made an entire series on this channel literally answering that question. Thank you, Liliana, for asking the question that started that series. These are very common questions. You're just going to have to take my word for it. This is my job. I can't tell you statistically, but I don't think anyone has those statistics. I am a leading expert on this game, and I'm telling you, this is what people are confused about. And that creates a situation where rather than them feeling like, okay, but I'll just be self-confident, I don't need anything now, I'll be prepared to adapt if something comes down the line, a lot of people actually, even more than they otherwise would, seek out opinions about this stuff. And that's where this impetus where every single player wants to know someone's opinion on every single thing. I'm guilty as charged because this is my entire career, is just espousing my opinion about stuff about Warframe. That's where that comes from to some degree. There's something about Warframe's design that causes people to ask the question more often. And then I think you might be able to see already what the problem is here. There isn't an answer because you don't need to do any of those things. And so it's almost not that people are misunderstanding, it's that things are being falsely prioritized. There's no need to give an answer to most of those questions. When people say, what's the best Warframe? Well, it doesn't matter. It's not that there isn't an answer exactly. It's that the answer is really irrelevant. Like, it doesn't, that will never help you. It doesn't matter. Or maybe a better way to say it is you shouldn't care. Like, you're mistaken that that's an important thing to know. But nobody answers questions that way. Like, people will just say a Warframe. Do you see? So people are being asked to give answers about a relatively complicated game where there really isn't an answer. And they're even more curious what those answers are because it's kind of unclear what questions they even should ask. That's a better way to explain what I was saying before. The thing about the game not having a single priority for you is that it creates this mindset where you don't know what questions to ask, so you ask bad questions because the game didn't help you ask good questions. One of Warframe's great shortcomings is that with all these weapon options that have different mechanics, lots of different utility, the game doesn't teach you to ask which ones would be good where, and yet they're there. And so that breadth and complexity, the game doesn't really teach you that it can be useful. It can be useful, but the game kind of doesn't help that along that much. That is an issue. I think that is the heart of the issue. Now, because we now have this heart of the issue, or at least I'm positing this is part of the problem, we do have an easy solution. What can we do to move forward? You said we as a community, but I'm going to talk about something that the developers can do too, because that's way more reliable. It's to make the game harder. I know that it might seem silly, but like, it's to make the game more difficult. It's not hard either, like not much more difficult, and not really later in the game necessarily. You just need to make it so the enemies in the early game more meaningfully react or die quicker or less quickly, depending on whether you have mods. The difficulty needs to be calibrated more precisely early on, such that the player is rewarded enough more for modding effectively, or like picking a weapon in a good situation, that they learn that that is valuable. That should be enough to create a trickle-down effect that gets players asking what's effective or what's enough to level up or to kill the enemies, and will prevent them from asking questions that sort of have no answer as much. They can ask those questions later when they come up, and it gets players in this loop where they try to earn more power because they actually need it, and then they earn it, and they're good to go. You might be saying this seems a bit different than the way Warframe is currently, but it's actually not. There's a system in Warframe that perfectly complements this, and it's the modding system. The way that mods work in Warframe is perfect for this type of feedback loop, because mods make a weapon so much more powerful than its base state that it should be very clear if you take out a calculator that the weapon is meant to be weak at base, but then gets more powerful as it's modded. The reason it isn't clear is because the weapon is so adequate unmodded that you don't really feel that big increase in power. But if you just made the enemies a little bit harder to kill, the difference, the percentage overall time to kill increase when you mod a weapon even a little bit is so enormous because of the way that mods work in this game that it's really easy to calibrate it in such a way where you give enemies just a little bit more health, and the time to kill just doesn't quite get there without mods, but then suddenly with mods it does. This is the solution. There are a few little parts of the solution. First of all, there are some new player mods that are weaker variants of mods you get later, or they're not literally the same mod but weaker, like flawed mods. They're a mod, but it's not going to be powerful later. It's just there as a filler. I don't know why these mods exist. A good example are the IPS mods that give you like 60%, like 60% impact damage. You know, there's those mods for every type of weapon. These mods don't make sense because early in the game, the mods are less powerful, so they're not ranked up as much. You don't have as much endo, so they're multiplying your damage by less, and your weapons are also less powerful with less multipliers, meaning that they're multiplying a lower number by a lower multiplier. So that just compounds how meaningless mods are. You might be asking, if it's so easy to calibrate the balance of the game this way, then why don't we just do it? Well, the current state of new player modding is not not quite there to accommodate this. It's only when you have a fully built out weapon that you mod it and it gains like 1,000% of its previous damage. Like, you get a weapon that's unranked with no mods, and then you mod a full build onto it, and you're doing like well over 10 times the damage that the weapon did before. But that's because your mods are ranked all the way up, because those mods are good, and because the weapon actually has good stats. All of this needs to change. You can have weapons early game have good stats because the player cannot make use of them in the same way. We already have a system that allows weapons to scale up as the game's difficulty goes on, and it's the modding system. It's ranking up mods. You don't need to make early game weapons so worthless from a supplemental stat perspective. In fact, they should be even better from a supplemental stat perspective, because the player is not going to have as much to work with as far as, the status chance. It needs to be a high base value because you're not going to multiply it by as much, right? So there are a number of ways you can do this. You can extremize how different the base damage of weapons is. At the moment, base damage on weapons it's really amazing how similar it is between different weapons, like a low-level weapon, a low MR weapon, and a high mastery rank weapon. The low MR ones consistently have less base damage, but you'd be surprised how small the difference is. How much less? No, how small the difference is. They should have dramatically less, because that value can still be noticeable multiplied by a certain amount. But if the weapon has like no status and no crit, you can't then multiply those values by a lot and get a lot, because you have to have a good base value, right? So that's a little wonky. It's like you might be in a situation where you need to change the player perception on status and crit. Like, at the moment, if a weapon has good status and crit, you're basically good to go. It's going to be a good weapon. There are very few exceptions. This would change that situation where you were much more looking at a weapon's base damage to fire rate ratio, and it would just kind of be assumed that status and crit are like pretty okay. There's some issues with that, but anyway, I don't know exactly, but this is the general thrust of how you would change that. I hope that makes sense. Another way that you can help with this, of course, is just getting rid of flawed mods. They do not make any sense. Having mods that, again, when you need the mods to make a bigger difference so that the players can notice that modding is the important way to make a weapon more powerful, you don't want to give them weaker mods. That doesn't make any sense. And they're also a waste of endo because you get the normal version so quickly for a lot of them. Yes, people will say in the comments, there's like flawed equilibrium has some corner case uses. Shut up, that's not part of this conversation. I know, but it doesn't matter, and it's not worth the confusion that the new players experience. Just get rid of flawed mods. It's a stupid system. I get why it might have once existed, but it's long out of date. Just get rid of it. And then we as the players, so we as the community, content creator, audience member of the game that is not part of this problem, but how can we make it better? It's hard. I do think that there is a sort of impossible feedback loop for content creators of this game where it's based on all these releases and new weapons, and the incentive to make individual videos on each new weapon is so high. I don't really see a way out of that. You can't just say, like, something that would help but that will never happen is if people stopped making videos on each individual weapon and tried to make videos talking about the systems, the way I've been trying to make content more. That would help a lot because it would drive home that you're not used to asking the wrong question. Again, the game doesn't teach you to ask good questions, but the content could. It never will, though, because the way that the incentive works, on YouTube and Twitch, is to cover the new stuff individually, as though it does matter to cover it individually, which it usually doesn't. There's nothing you can really do there. So I do think if anybody there's basically no chance of making any headway, it's with creators. You, as a viewer, you can ask your creators, you can say, I want to discuss this type of thing, this system, how in general do we figure out, our own weapon. But this is never going to work, not only because the creators have such an incentive to cover things individually without discussing the whole system. They don't want to teach their audience to fish because then they don't need to buy fish from them anymore. I'm told this all the time. Yes, I know. I just don't care. I want you to have a good time playing the game more than I care about me getting more clicks. I don't want you to need my content. I want you to want my content. That's, of course, nobody else agrees, but whatever. But it's also because of the players. For a lot of players, I mean, it's your leisure time. You don't necessarily want to have to understand a system behind it. Not everybody enjoys optimizing things or enjoys optimizing their experience of a thing. They enjoy maybe optimizing their damage insofar as they understand they can optimize it, but they don't enjoy changing their thinking about how to do that. I do. I know a lot of you do because you watch my content, but a lot of people don't enjoy that, and that's totally understandable. A lot of people have to do that for a job, and they don't like doing it, but they have to do it for a job. I have to do it for a job, and I do like it. So when they're in their leisure time, when they're playing a video game, they don't want to do that thing. They're taking a break from doing that thing. Totally understandable, and there's no way to change this. So you can't stop people from asking. I would say, oh, encourage your creators to make content this way, and then they will. But they won't, because you'll never change the fundamental property of the world that most people simply do not want to understand the underlying system. There's no way to make headway there. However, I do think that you as individuals, in this case, actually have more influence than creators in a lot of ways. And that is because you can talk to your friends about this. You can enable your friends to understand a thing better by simply giving them recommendations. You don't have to teach them the system if they don't want to hear it, but you can still provide that system, the information from that system, when it is requested. I have a lot of experience that I don't love, actually, but in my short life, with having people in my friend group who value the way that I think, but they don't want to think that way. Like, they want me to think that way. They want people who can answer the question in a way that is nuanced, and they enjoy hearing that, but they don't want to themselves learn how to do it. In other words, they do want to know the system. They just don't want to be the one who knows, if that makes sense. That's an awkward way to put it, but it's not like people hate learning information. Like, people ask all the time, like, this weapon doesn't do enough damage, or I'm dying a lot. Like, what do I do? You can help them by explaining this thing. And that puts them in a mindset where that was a good question. See, that did help. And then when they move forward, they think, oh, that's a way to think about how to improve and understand the game better that actually works, that actually pays off. This brings us back to the practical example of the crit is king thing. You thought I forgot about that, didn't you? Because this has been 32 minutes long. No, of course not. Our practical example is this. So I talked about what our developers can do. They can make use modding to its fullest extent and make it matter more noticeably in the early game, helping players ask the right questions, which will help them get answers that actually make sense and lead them on a path to understanding the game. Understanding the game has to become more important, and luckily, the modding system already provides a way to do this, since Warframe's weapons are so weak by default and become so many orders of magnitude stronger when modded properly. The math is not just for kicks in Warframe. It has such a dramatic difference. It's not a small marginal difference you're getting. If you use marginal benefit analysis and you use separate multipliers, the difference is not minor, it's huge. And so you will notice, like, the players will figure it out. You just have to give them an environment where they feasibly could figure it out. Again, the core problem here is that in the early game, modding actually doesn't increase your weapon's damage by that much of an order of magnitude. If it did, people would learn from the start that that was how to do that, and that would have a trickle-down effect where they would spend their whole time going through the early game, thinking about things in a more productive way, asking questions that make more sense and have answers, rather than needing to dig for answers that kind of aren't there, and getting the community's random annoyed sentiment, like some person being like, oh, this thing is not powerful enough, suddenly becomes something a new player found as information, rather than just some random person complaining. How are these random people complaining getting so much influence? That's how. And that's how to get them to have less influence. And then you as players can explain to people just when they ask how things work. You don't necessarily have to teach them to think that way. For my part, I have little choice either way. People would either go to me to be taught how to think that way or go to me to be given the answer. But you, as people who are just friends with people who play, you can casually do something that's in between those two things. And when somebody says, oh, crit, whatever, you can explain that, like, if it's not doing enough damage, adding some corrosive or viral would also add a damage multiplier, and then your crit will be getting 100% more damage from that viral proc as well, which is separate from all that other damage, and then you're getting that much more. Maybe if you do that instead, you'll get more damage. This is something that most people are pretty receptive to, and that can help. Those two things combined can help. And I think it's worth noting that the meta thoughts from the community about this kind of game can change quite quickly. This could still be done, and you could turn the whole thing around. It's not just pedantry to talk about it this way. So anyway, that's what I think. I hope that makes sense. I'm not 100% confident in this. I'm often asked to espouse opinions, and something I'm trying to do more is not force myself to have an opinion when I don't have one, or have an answer if I don't have one, and recognize that I'm often being asked to start a discussion, not to fix everything. You all are very reasonable about that, and I sort of put it on myself to have the answer to everything, which I shouldn't. And then there's also a similar problem where I think when I have an answer for something, I do have an answer for something, like I had the answer to this, I think it's worth saying how confident I am that that's a good idea, and this is maybe in the 75% confidence ballpark. I am not positive that this is really what's going on. I'm pretty confident, but there could be some other things going on here. Let me see if I can put to words. There are a few things over the years that I've thought, oh, but it might be this, though. You know? So one little side topic, this one's a little negative, is that outrage is PR. There's a thing that some people say about the way that this game is developed and directed and published by Digital Extremes. The argument goes, all PR is good PR. So it makes more sense for them to make a Warframe with abilities that are not necessarily the way that people will think they're going to be powerful. The Warframe is fine, so when people use it at first, they'll be fine. If you buy it day one, it'll be fine. And yet, they get to patch it, because the players will complain, they always do. And then if they patch it, that encourages players to complain in the future, which gets them more invested. And it means that if you were earning the Warframe instead of paying to get it, you're now more excited to get it. You could view it that way. I don't agree with this, but this is a thing I've heard people say, which has this sort of dual benefit. And then the cycle repeats itself. Every update, the community's been encouraged to complain because it worked last time, but they were encouraged to complain on purpose. This is not a vicious cycle like I was saying before. This could be interpreted as a willful decision to keep this feedback loop going. This could be less malicious than it sounds, too. The developers might simply view it, in this argument, as listening to community feedback. We'll just put it out in whatever way, and then listen to community feedback and change it. And they're basically always buffs at first. But the reality is that probably that mindset has put them in a design mindset where they just let things be not quite there, or they're not sure. They kind of abandon thinking about how the community will feel about them, and just let people react. Again, it doesn't have to be that they're evilly, deliberately making things too weak to get people to backlash, to force them to be emotionally invested, so that they can then change it and buff it, get the players that are grinding for it to be excited enough, and then repeat the cycle. It doesn't have to be this willful, evil thing, but that is part of how the argument goes. Do I think that that is what is going on? No. Does that make sense? Yeah. You know. So for what it's worth, that is a thing that I have heard people say, and I do think that there are game publishers that do that. No need to get into those now, and they're just speculative. I don't know. I've thought that before about other publishers. I don't think that's what's going on here. I do think that what I was explaining is why, but am I bulletproof, 99% confidence about it? No. Maybe 75% for what it's worth. Liliana, thank you for your excellent question, as always, and for your staunch support.